and welcome to a brand new episode of the Weekly Defense Podcast, the show about defense procurement and military technology. I'm your host, Alex Valenti, and with me today on the special 27th session of the third season of the podcast are Air Editor Tim Martin and Senior Land Reporter Tim Fish. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering why I said special 27th edition. So that's because I am delighted to introduce to our listeners a new member of the Shephard's news team. And I want to welcome for the first time on the show, Shephard's naval reporter, Harry Lai. Hi, Harry, and welcome to the team.
Hi, thank you. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Just joined Shephard and quite excited to be on my first episode of the podcast.
Good to have you on board, Harry.
Oh, you're going to love it. It's brilliant.
Yeah, we're going to put you in the hot seat immediately. I hope you don't mind.
I'll do my best.
I'm sure it'll be better than your best. So let's dig into what we're going to be discussing today, shall we? And we will focus our conversation in this first part of the show on the air and naval domains. We'll be looking at some news from the Swiss skies and discussing ship sustainment approaches. And of course, we won't neglect the land domain, as in the second part of the show, we will speak to Shephard's Defense Insight land analyst for a detailed conversation of the market requirements for the armoured vehicles in Northern Africa. And it's time to start with our top stories for today. This week, we will start in Germany with the Bundeswehr, pushing ahead with an ambitious program for its entire fleet of Puma AFVs as it heads towards the development of a new armoured division. The S-1 upgrade includes various enhancements such as new anti-tank missile, optronic systems, and battle management software. And over in Central Europe, the Czech Army's artillery fire control system acquisition program is finally set to come to fruition this year following COVID-related delays. The budget for a new system was approved in November 2020, meaning that interested companies are just waiting for the next stage to begin with the request for proposals. Over in the UK, the Defence Science Technology Lab has received funding to work with industry on innovative new missile systems by 2023. In the Cooperative Strike Weapons Technology Demonstrator Programme, the STL will lead efforts not only to improve the performance of current systems, but also to explore inter-missile communication that would allow missiles to work together. And lastly, in Singapore, the Navy is rolling out augmented reality glasses to its naval fleet. This will enable crew on deployment to rectify faults with subject matter experts back on shore. And this concludes our top stories for the week. Now, let's put Harry on the hot seat, as I said at the beginning of the podcast. And you published a story yesterday, actually, Harry, on BAE Systems providing data storage and management system for the UK Royal Navy. So perhaps, to begin digging into the story, could you explain to those who haven't yet read it what this system will entail?
So essentially the system is a Google for warships. So anything you could ever want to know about a ship, whether it's a part, a technical manual or a schematic, you can essentially search for it in a search box like you would on Google. And a lot of hard computer work goes on in the background and it recalls the information for you. So it's part of a big data push from the Royal Navy as they're trying to kind of digitize all of their systems and improve sustainment by having better access to the information that shipbuilders or people repairing the ships need to do their jobs.
Is this kind of like, am I understanding it right? It's sort of predictive maintenance also? Will it help predictive maintenance?
It's not predictive maintenance, so that's kind of a separate work stream, and there is some work going on in that regard. But this is just simply a way of, by my understanding, simply a way of allowing people to get better and quicker access to the information they need. So if you need, say if there's a problem with the propeller or the transmission, you can search it up and you can see what components are used, and then you can say, maybe it's this bit, and you know kind of what you need to order if you need to replace something, rather than going and searching through manuals or databases.
It'd be interesting to kind of find out what digitization of equipment, manuals and everything they've got already, and how this would actually make a much more of an impact than what the systems they've already got. They called it Google for warships, right? But I think that's just a tagline to make it sound sexier than it is and to market it a bit better. But I think, is it right that it's only for BAE Systems built ships at the moment in terms of the classes that it can be put on?
So it's BAE told me they were delivering it basically under an enterprise model. So they're giving the software to the Royal Navy, they're putting it in place, and the Royal Navy can add up to 5 ship classes to it. So whether that's BAE built ships, or it could be in future the Type 31s and Type 32s being built by Babcock. So it doesn't actually matter what, say, brand of ship it is. You can kind of, if the Royal Navy owns the information, they can plug it in. So anything on the system is owned by the Royal Navy. They choose who has access to it. And it's part of a wider support model framework that they're trying to consolidate all these different streams of information into one tool that everyone uses, rather than having a BAE system for the Type 26s and a Babcock system for the Type 31s and something different for the carriers and the mine hunters.
Yeah, and that seems to be the main benefit of it, is that you don't have to train on a separate system, and that you can just transition your support staff from one class to another without having stovepiped personnel on each different ship class. And yeah, in terms of actually speeding up the actual maintenance itself, I mean, I don't know, that probably won't have too much of an impact, it sounds, but it looks like there will be cost savings on the personnel training side and transition side in the long term, I guess.
They did say they couldn't kind of quantify it, but obviously they did extol the benefits of being able to find information straight away, which is, I suppose, something we're all used to in our daily lives. And so it must be quite a frustration if you can't do it in your job.
Yeah, I guess so. If they can't quantify it, means because there isn't any financial benefit probably, but there probably are the other savings long term. And it must be a bit annoying if in your civilian life, and this is the case, I guess, a lot of military systems, because they're quite dated, unless they've been upgraded relatively recently, then you're going to go use your phone and do whatever you like with it and do all kinds of comms, and then you go to your work and in the military sphere and have to sort of wade through non-digital systems or stuff that's commissioned a while ago.
Yeah, you go from a world of kind of easy access to everything being hard to do, or harder than it should be.
Yeah. And so, am I getting this right? I was looking at the article. So, what kind of ships is it going to be delivered for at the moment? Is it the Queen Elizabeth, the Type 45, another one?
It's those two and the Type 26s, which are being built kind of at the moment. And it's BAE, I suppose, had a bit of a head start on development because they built a similar interim system for the aircraft carriers. So that's already been in place, and that kind of helped the Royal Navy come up with the idea of what they wanted.
Right. And are they rolling this out to, for instance, exactly the Type 26, we know that other Commonwealth navies are getting a variant. So is this being rolled out to other navies?
There's been inquiries. So BAE said people have kind of contacted them with interest in developing a similar system or having something in place, but they obviously can't comment on them due to the sensitivity of discussions, is what they said. But there is a similar system already in place in Canada for its Halifax class frigates. So something similar does exist, and the Canadian system is probably, in terms of its common core of what it does and how it does it, is quite similar to the Royal Navy system. Well,
I guess it shows that when it comes to maintenance and sustainment, that any even sort of small benefits and small improvements can reap quite a lot of rewards. I mean, I just wrote a feature for Naval Warfare magazine about warship upkeep and sustainment, and talking to kind of a variety of shipbuilders, Navantia, Fincantieri, General Dynamics, NASCO, Babcock as well, because they're upgrading the UK Type 23 frigates at the moment in a midlife upgrade. And anything that you can do to improve, any money spent on sustainment and maintenance is money well spent. I mean, I also wrote a story this week about HMAS Perth in Australia, the Anzac class frigate, sort of coming out of dock after 4 years out of service. So it shows that if you don't get your maintenance and your sustainment right, you're going to lose capability. If you've got a major frigate out of service for that long, because of maintenance and emerging defects that have come out when the ship was in its midlife upgrade, then it's going to mean that you don't have that ship at sea for a lot longer. And I think the Australian Navy have said that they've only got 2 of their 8 Anzac class frigates available so far in 2021, which is, pretty bad in terms of your availability. I mean, apparently they're sorting those problems out, but it's not a surprise either. These things don't just jump on you from nowhere. The Australian Navy in the past few years has been criticised by the Australian National Audit Office, and details that were released in the Senate Estimates Committee sort of highlight the impact that delays and cost savings in maintenance can have. They knew what they were doing. They deliberately delayed maintenance work and sustainment activities to make short-term cost savings, fully aware in the knowledge that this would have impact down the line. And lo and behold, you send your ships in for a maintenance period, and all of a sudden all these extra problems start emerging, which should have been fixed, and it just makes that particular maintenance period drag on for much, much longer, and you end up with less ships available at the end of it. So all these things do impact capability. Yes. I understand that on the... sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to, hammer this down, saying like 2 ships out of 8. It's pretty embarrassing, really.
Yeah, it is. I mean, they should know this sort of thing, really, and they've had problems with personnel as well. But again, that's not something that just happens overnight. These are sort of long-term planning issues. I understand that obviously in the air domain, it's pretty similar with when maintenance comes into play. I think with the Swiss F-35 decision, apparently some of the calculations about why that was the best aircraft for them were down to maintenance and sustainment. Is that right, Tim?
Yeah, so I suppose maybe fair to say that it's caused a lot of eyebrows to be raised in terms of how the Swiss came to the decision that the F-35 is the best aircraft, going off operational costs and forward planning. Just to kind of underline what really surprised everyone, I guess, was the judgment that when Switzerland announced the decision, they said that it offered the highest overall benefit at the lowest overall cost. So just to offer a bit more on that in terms of what you were mentioning about sustainment and operational costs, in terms of the 5th generation fighter being associated with the lowest overall cost, that doesn't seem to bear out, to be perfectly blunt, given the sustainment costs in particular of the F-35 as well. It's quoted anywhere around per flight hour $35,000 to $38,000, and that's really causing consternation in Congress as well on the US and the US side of the house. And there is some debate as to when exactly Lockheed Martin will be able to get down to $25,000 per flight hour. So, given that, and given that the Congressional Research Service has also said, going off kind of figures from December 2019, that F-35 works out at $130 million per aircraft, and that's going off the aircraft itself at 108, and then adding the engine for it as well. Those numbers just don't compute really when you compare them to figures for 4th gen. So it's really extraordinary that Switzerland have been able to justify this decision, not just all around cost, I should say. The F-35 was judged to be best in capabilities, of course, too. That isn't a surprise, and I don't think other manufacturers they might be able to, they might claim that it's comparable capability, but I think it's fair to say that the maturity of the F-35 and the capabilities that come with it are objectively seen as more advanced than competitor aircraft. But again, just go back to the bigger picture, mentioning that this is worthwhile on the costs and sustainment front it's very hard to get your head around.
It seems funny that they'd be able to spend so much money on an aircraft, but then at that sort of cost per flight hour, you might not be able to fly them for that long. And it just makes you also wonder, like, if Lockheed Martin can actually get down those costs from 38 down to 25, what they'd have to do to make that kind of saving.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that there's no disclosure of which competitors sat behind the F-35 in terms of operational costs and total procurement, because Switzerland judged that over 30 years for the F-35 to be 15.5 billion Swiss franc, and they said that the second competitor behind that was 2 billion Swiss franc more than the F-35. Again, I think that is quite an extraordinary figure, to be quite honest. Bearing all that in mind, it looks like there could be more twists and turns ahead, because you might have a situation, as Switzerland did previously with the Gripen, where the government and parliament the selection of the aircraft, but it goes to a vote, and the Swiss public then decide whether or not the actual buying of the aircraft should happen. And when it came to that, of course, Gripen wasn't selected. And that's obviously what got us here originally. So you could have another situation like that. So,
well, actually, I was reading in one of the blogs of one of the French defense journalists who writes a lot about all these things. He was writing about the decision, and he was mentioning a couple of interesting things. But before moving to that, I wanted to pick up on the fact that I was also reading the comments, which are usually fairly intriguing as well on this article.
That's a dangerous game, Alex.
It's a very dangerous game. But actually, I was running a find word, so I skipped most of the nonsense, which there was plenty of. But some of it was saying that so it needs to be voted in Parliament still, so that's not completely won. But some people were saying, right, well, the Swiss voted November, I think, for the budget. And they were saying that it was unlikely in terms of how things are usually done for these decisions in Switzerland. It was unlikely that a second vote for the same project, second referendum, would be done. So I don't know in terms of the population. I think there is. If they were to vote, they probably would say no, as they did last time. But it looks unlikely that there might be a second referendum on this topic.
But I suppose from the wider picture, just looking at what Switzerland want, effectively this is an aircraft for our police in Switzerland, of course, famously neutral when it comes to conflict. So there is also, I guess, a judgment to be made around whether or not the F-35 is in effect overkill for the mission, whether you have the array of air-to-air missiles and so forth on it. And, I think we would be into the world would be in a very strange position if Switzerland was under attack and 36 F-35s are on high alert and so forth. So, I mean, I add that just as a bit of colour, I guess, and to suggest that potentially there's the decision is very political, as these kind of high-level decisions often are. But it does strike me as slightly odd when you kind of look at you unpick the numbers and so forth. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think if you look on Twitter and you look at what other journalists and other analysts are saying, and those that actually I might even suggest know a bit more than I do, are saying, that this does seem like a fairly strange decision to understand. However, you can also take it on a different path and suggest that Lockheed Martin have been good when it comes to suggesting that the aircraft going off the production line and what's signed in terms of contracts and so forth, that the price of the aircraft will come down, and you could also say that the majority of the aircraft and it becoming operational with more nations and so forth will mean that the costs to new customers is certainly of benefit, and you could argue that Switzerland have bought into that. So what's probably interesting in terms of next step, what this means for European fighter procurement, it'll be worthwhile to see what happens now with Finland in the HX competition. There's a contract due for that at the end of 2021. Now, that's not to kind of suggest that Finland will be swayed by what Switzerland have done. And of course, there's very different requirements. You have Russia on the doorstep of Finland, and I'm quite sure that those kind of threats will take precedence in terms of evaluations and so forth. But I don't think we can now. I think we are at a stage now where the F-35 has consistently won big procurements across Europe, with the exception of Germany, and of course it wasn't actually part of that competitive process. Germany kind of forced Lockheed Martin out before it could, really make an argument. So with that exception given, Lockheed Martin we haven't have really lost a competitive bid right across Europe. So when the Finnish decision comes around at the end of the year, actually think it'll be very tough to suggest before then that the F-35 isn't the leading candidate for that one as well.
Yeah, well, as you said, it's very political, and it's always very political. And I can tell you that obviously our French Minister for Defense is not pleased, as 2 French fighters were in the competition for that, and she was also, as you were saying, looking at you were talking about the strategic aspects from Switzerland and talking about politics. You also think, well, there are a lot of partnership between France and Switzerland, and suddenly, Florence Parly thought, okay, so we have a lot of partnerships. There's one being signed soon about space, and Switzerland having access to space data from France, and there's going to be also this partnership from on the aerial defense front. So I think she was a little bit taken aback by the decision in Switzerland, and
that's quite interesting, because you could see a similar scenario happening here with Finland, because you have Sweden, who are obviously very closely tied with Finland, but also political alliances and so forth. So if Gripen doesn't win out in the HX competition, I'm quite sure you'll probably hear similar things from the Minister of Defence in Sweden and from Saab as well. And because, of course, Saab have even gone so far as to say that they'll give co-development to Finland on Gripen. So they're pretty much bending over backwards, really, to get that contract and push the F-35 out. But yes, as you say, these things are typically very political.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. And I'm sure we could have, as always, been talking about this for much longer. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. So thanks very much, Harry, for joining us today. Great to have you in the team once more.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Thanks very much, you guys, for all these insights, as always. And for our listeners, as always, you can check these and more stories, previous episodes of the podcast, video content, and more by visiting our website, shepherdmedia.com/news. Time now for a short break. And we will be back in a few moments, and this time with our multimedia journalist, Noemi Di Stefano, who will be speaking to senior land analyst at Shephard Defence Insight, Sonny Butterworth. Stay tuned.
Artificial intelligence is rapidly changing the world in which we live. Evidence of artificial intelligence is all around us and will have profound implications on everyday life in the decades to come. In the military world, artificial intelligence technologies are having a similarly massive effect and are beginning to change the face of modern warfare. Artificial intelligence and machine learning applications promise to enhance productivity, reduce user workload, and operate more quickly than humans. But this doesn't come without its challenges. How easy is it for an adversary to fool artificial intelligence systems? How well do AI systems cope with a chaotic and ever-changing conflict? And how will the human in the loop oversee AI systems on a battlefield swarming with autonomous assets? The Artificial Intelligence on the Battlefield podcast dives into these issues and more. How will artificial intelligence reshape the future of warfare? Created by Shephard Studio, in partnership with our sponsor Sistel, the Artificial Intelligence on the Battlefield podcast is coming soon on shepherdmedia.com/news or wherever you get your podcasts.
And a warm welcome back to our listeners. Welcome back to the show. For the next 15 minutes or so, you will be with me, Noemi Di Stefano, and I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast once more our senior land analyst for Shephard Defence Insight, Sonny Butterworth. Sonny, hi, how are you?
Hi, Noemi. I'm not too bad, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm the only thing is I'm just like looking for summer. But I can't see it anywhere, really. Right, so We are here to talk about Northern Africa in the defense context, of course. Northern Africa is a very difficult and troubled region, a hotbed of terrorist activity, as well as a potential threat to, as NATO itself defines it, to NATO's southern flank. And even though the majority of Northern African states lack the ability to develop new military platforms at an indigenous level, as you write in one of your analysis pieces, Sonny, that we will be dissecting in a minute, these countries demonstrate huge commitment to procure platforms from solid powers, such as Russia and the US, but also from, let's say, emerging powers such as the well-feared China, Turkey, and the UAE. So the market in Northern Africa for these platforms exists. And I wanted to talk about it then with you, Sonny. But just before diving deep into the market itself, I just wanted to set the background to our conversation and ask you, what exactly are the threats that Northern African countries face, and how does this then translate into requirements for armoured vehicles?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro there, Naomi, it's historically been quite a troubled region and it remains very volatile today. And so there's a wide variety of different types of threats that all of the states in that region face. I think you can kind of break them down into perhaps like three main ones. So you have in the sense that, first of all, the external threats, so regional tensions between the states of the region and also their neighbours. I think historically that's driven procurement in large part. I think Egypt and Israel, they need to build up their conventional forces. But also there's other flashpoints as well. So Western Sahara, fairly recently things flared up there, and that has the potential to cause friction between Algeria and Morocco. So I think countries in the region are looking to deter their regional adversaries and have superiority in the conventional sense. There's also problems of internal security, so that's another type of threat. And we have examples such as Sinai in Egypt, where there's a threat from Islamist insurgents. And I think, again, this increases the demand for armoured vehicles that can provide protected mobility to troops that are tasked with patrolling and ensuring security in these regions. And of course, also the governments of the region face increased threats from social unrest, border security, particularly with the mass migration at the moment as more and more refugees and migrants try to get into Europe. So again, armoured vehicles for the maintenance of law and order and also to repress domestic opposition are much in demand in the region at the moment too. I think if we look at, say, Libya, this really kind of epitomises the potential of the situation and the threats here. We have a proxy war going on really between the different powers vying for influence in the region. So we have Turkey supplying the government of national accord, and then several other powers supplying the Libyan National Army, such as Egypt, UAE, Russia, France also providing its support. We then have the risk of that spilling over into neighbouring countries. So we think about the news recently in Chad, where the president was killed. Some of the opposition forces there were believed to be supported or come across the border from Libya. So there's that threat of spillover too from neighbouring countries. So they really do have to face a very diverse set of threats, and it's quite a tense security situation. So they have requirements for lots of different types of armoured vehicles, from conventional right down to counterinsurgency and law and order.
Yeah, you paint a full picture of these threats. So in terms of creating that deterrence that you mentioned and looking at countermeasures, what kind of armoured vehicles have Northern African states procured as a countermeasure?
Yeah, they've really procured quite a wide range of different vehicles, and also quite a lot of them too. I think one of the things that's very significant about the region is just how large the fleets are, both what they have in active service and in storage. Part of this is historical legacy. So, as I mentioned, countries like Egypt, where it was preparing for several wars with Israel, they received quite a lot of military equipment from the Soviet Union and elsewhere. And so they have quite a large number of equipment that's aimed at either deterring a conventional adversary or gain superiority conventionally. So we're talking large numbers of tanks, of tracked APCs, those sorts of vehicles. And And that's really reflected in the inventory data. So we believe that perhaps 74% of the total inventory of armoured vehicles in the region is tracked vehicles, which again are well suited for this type of warfare. Having said that, in recent years, we've seen a considerable number of lighter wheeled vehicles as well. So I'm talking here about things like mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. And I'm talking here about 4x4s, such as those based on commercial off-the-shelf chassis. Such as those based on the Land Cruiser with an armoured body. We've seen much more of those being purchased to help with counterinsurgency operations. So again, quite a wide spectrum. I think one of the other interesting things, perhaps, when we compare North African procurement to the rest of the world, is that there are considerably fewer heavy wheeled vehicles. So I'm thinking 6x6 or 8x8 platforms, where demand has really taken off in countries like Europe, Asia as well in particular, because these platforms are quite easy to deploy around the world. They make it much easier to project force because they have a bit better strategic and operational mobility compared to tracked vehicles. But with North Africa, the focus on these countries is more their immediate threats. So they're not worried so much about projecting their forces a long way from home. And so I think they haven't invested so much in these wheeled vehicles. So when we look at the 8x8s, for example, that are operated by these countries, they're predominantly Soviet BTR series, which aren't really up to the standards of the current 8x8 armoured vehicles. And so I think that's quite an interesting thing that stands out in the region as well.
So there is a market for both trucked and wheeled, but more for trucked platforms, I understand correctly, right? I think
historically there's certainly been more of a demand for tracked vehicles, and I think that will still remain there. But I think we're seeing an increase in the number of wheeled vehicles just because of this, the prominence of threats to internal security, particularly, like you say, from terrorist groups. So I think that market is growing too.
Okay. But you mentioned at the start that the region though remains quite volatile. So do you think that in the long term there will continue to be a high demand for both trucked and wheeled vehicles, or will it maybe drop in the future?
I think we're still going to see high demand. I think states certainly have the need and the ambition to procure much more armoured vehicles in the future. The threats are still going to persist, and many countries, particularly the big spenders such as Morocco and Egypt, have plans to increase their defence budget and procure more equipment. So the will is certainly there. I think also there is quite a pressing need because many of these platforms now that are still in service at the moment are quite old. So they've been in service perhaps 40 years, and sometimes they haven't had their midlife upgrades. So I think that many of them will need to either be upgraded, substantially overhauled, or even replaced by new platforms if they're to remain viable in the future. So again, I think that will create strong demand too, because states are going to want to maintain these capabilities if they can. So we actually forecast that perhaps 63% of the current inventories of these countries are going to be in need of some kind of overhaul, repair, upgrade within the next 10 years. And this is particularly in like the MBT sector, where again many of the platforms really are kind of Cold War legacy platforms that aren't sort of, or starting to become less viable when faced with the new platforms on the market today. But it's also, I guess, worth noting that it is difficult to forecast in this region just because of the lack of transparency in terms of how, what states intend to spend their money on and how they will finance it and when they want to procure all these capabilities. But certainly from the signals we have got, it seems like there's going to be plenty of demand. We've already identified several potential main battle tank sales, say in Morocco, where they have approval for a second batch of M1A1 Abrams upgraded from the US. So it's a foreign military sales deal. Algeria looks like it's going to continue to procure T90 main battle tanks. And then we also have Egypt, which has been rumoured to be interested in the T90. Nothing's really been substantiated about those rumours, but we can well imagine that they might want to procure some new main battle tanks to replace some of their legacy designs. And even a country like Tunisia, which doesn't operate that many, I think about 45 M60s, the M60 being now quite an old platform with probably, while there are some upgrade packages available for it, it might in the end be cheaper and easier to just procure a new platform as well. So yeah, there's plenty of demand, and we think there will be going forwards too.
I wanted to pick up on the financial aspect that you mentioned. So, in terms of on a practical level, due to the heavy price tags of these vehicles, are Northern African states able to afford this procurement, especially if we consider the wider impact and the long-term impact of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's something really to pick up on, because there are certainly, I think, several risks to this high level of military expenditure and whether these plans can be fully realised as North African states would like them to. So it's everything from looking at oil prices. So a country like Algeria, which I think is quite dependent on this for its economy, should they fall, its purchasing power is going to be affected and it might not be able to buy as much equipment as it likes. Similarly, we also notice that many North African states appear to rely on credit from foreign powers to finance their major plans. So a couple of examples. Recently, our journalists reported on Egypt's order for Dassault Rafale fighter jets. And they note that probably this is dependent on favourable loans and credit extensions from a French bank. And I think the same is also true of Morocco's purchase of self-propelled artillery systems and air defence systems as well. So it's all dependent really on foreign actors. It's not necessarily the case that they can finance all of this by themselves, because their defence budgets are globally quite small compared to their aspirations and the size of their fleets. I think it's also worth noting perhaps that we're a bit unclear with Egypt particularly, which has in recent years announced that it will order, or there's been indications that it will order quite significant volumes of fairly high-end military equipment. It's quite unclear who's financing that. It could be some of their Middle Eastern allies, perhaps UAE is giving them a helping hand. And so the question is, will that continue? Is that sustainable? So I think while the demand certainly is there and there's the will to procure these platforms, there are some risks, particularly with COVID and the global disruption that could cause and the economic aftermath that we're probably still yet to see in full, that these plans could be threatened in that way as well. So yeah, there's definitely it's definitely worth considering the threats of that spending as well, and not just painting too much of an optimistic picture for procurement in the region.
Yeah, there are a lot of question marks of how countries with shrinked defense budgets look to procure high-end capabilities. Fascinating. If we do look at potential suppliers, which suppliers look best placed to capitalize and pick up on this demand?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. It's one of the really interesting things about the region as a whole, is the fact that it's historically and going forward looks to procure from quite a wide range of different suppliers. So, I mean, first of all, it really depends on where you look and which country you consider. But historically, as from the region as a whole, the US and Russia have benefited most from demand. And of course, the Soviet Union, leading into Russia, had quite a big influence in the region too. But there are signs, perhaps, that the US, which is the largest exporter of armoured vehicles to the region, could begin to be displaced by some of its rivals. So a good example is this. If you look at Algeria, which is predominantly procuring its equipment from Russia, but has also signed a big deal with Germany's Rheinmetall to produce about 980 Fuchs 2 6x6 armoured vehicles, and they're going to be licensed produced in the country. And the same, the UAE's Nima is producing the Ajban 4x4 protected vehicles in Algeria too. So again, they're procuring from quite a wide range there. If you think that's Germany, Russia, and the UAE, several countries meeting Algeria's demand. I think as well, China and Turkey could increase their sales in the region going forwards as well. So China, again, has already sold some self-propelled mortars and self-propelled artillery to Algeria. Turkey, as we know, is looking to expand its geopolitical influence in the area, and it's supplying armoured vehicles to the government in Libya, as I mentioned. Again, the UAE is also keen to extend its influence. So I think they're also licensed producing vehicles in Egypt. So yeah, really, there's quite a wide range of different suppliers and countries looking to make their stamp in the region. And I think going forward, we're going to see quite a variegated marketplace. That's not to say, that the US won't still secure some sales. As I mentioned, the sale possibly to Morocco earlier, that's worth quite a lot of money. And again, France, which has quite close historical ties, of course, to Morocco, has sold a small number of armoured vehicles, and there are signs that it might also sell the VAB Mark III 6x6 to Morocco in the near future too.
You mentioned a lot of international suppliers who could benefit from opportunities in this region, but what about in-house suppliers? Is there a potential for a growth in domestic industry in some of the Northern African countries, do you think?
I think, like many other countries in the world, North African states would like to procure as much of their equipment as possible from domestic suppliers if they can. And that's been the case historically too. So there have been several instances of large deals involving license assembly of foreign designs. So one big one to mention would be Egypt's licensed production of the M1A1 Abrams from the US. They produced about 1,130 over quite a long time period. I think this deal goes back to the 1980s, and they only recently finished completing all of them. I also mentioned Algeria, which has got several deals with Western and companies from the UAE to license produce armoured vehicles too. But while they can assemble these foreign designs, I think their ability to develop their own indigenous platforms, specifically to meet their own requirements, is much more limited, and it's still very much in its early stages. And as is typically the case, where we see the most activity in this realm is in the development of lighter 4x4 and mine-protected vehicles. So a good example here is Egypt, which has the manufacturer IMUT, which has produced a series of 4x4 vehicles, the ST500 and ST100. And it looks like those will enter service with the Egyptian Armed Forces sometime in the near future. They've also operated the Temsar, the Crocodile series of armoured vehicles as well. And even a country like Tunisia just last year showcased a domestic 4x4 armoured vehicle called the Barb. We don't really know much about it in terms of its capabilities or what exactly it was designed for, but it shows that the aspiration is there. But I think that because the capacity is still so limited, that many of these countries are still going to ultimately need to import a lot of their armoured vehicles into the near future.
So a long way to go, will you say?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's aspirational, but it's going to take a while, I think, for them to really meet most of their demand domestically.
Okay, Sonny, thank you very much for this insight. Of course, if for our listeners, if you want to find out more about Sonny's analysis or the rest of the Defence Insight team analysis, you can check our digital magazine publications. And Sonny, until next time, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much, Naomi.
From your home office to out at sea to on mission. Shephard News is used by more than 4 million government, military and industry professionals across the globe. So what are you waiting for? Start your 14-day free trial to premium news and join ranks with those in the know. Head to shepherdmedia.com/subscribe today.
You have been listening to another episode of the Weekly Defense Podcast. As always, a big thanks to everyone who took the time to be part of the episode. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed today's show, make sure you like and subscribe and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also start a conversation or give us feedback joining the Global Defense Community Group on LinkedIn, a platform to interact with our team of journalists and analysts and discuss breaking news as it happens. Head over to shepherdmedia.com/Global Defense Community or search Global Defense Community on LinkedIn to join. Until next week, thanks for listening.